You're pressed between planks and bodies, a rope bites into your wrists, the air in the hold is thick with salt and the sour rot of fish. You taste metal from your own panic. Around you, someone coughs until blood stains the straw. Somewhere above, oars cut the grey sea and sink. The rhythm is a sentence. You remember the altar stone, the thin light through the east window, the smell of wax and vellum. 6 days ago you sang Compline beneath a crucifix. 6 days ago you imagined the world ordered. Now you are a number. Hands have torn the habit that named you sister. A man shoved fingers under your jaw, examined your teeth, judged your worth. You felt them measure you by the constants of bodies and markets. The monks died at the choir stalls. The abbess was killed in the cloister. The ones who fell under iron lie in the wake of bell ropes and spilled wine. You do not allow yourself to think about the ship's horizon. You think only about the small, sharp certainty of hunger and how that certainty is structured. It is not only pain, it is decision, whether to keep faith as if it were a talisman or to fold it up and hide it in your mouth like a stone. There are others in the dark, women who will not speak for fear of tearing the thin thread of survival that remains. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. The command in the hold is not an invitation. The pirates, the men from the north, move like surgeons. They inspect the women, make notes with the quick economy of those who trade in people as other men trade in grain. They separate the youngest from the oldest, the able from the broken. You are 15 by how you count the seasons. Some call you Hilda in a prayer scratched on stolen wood. You will learn later that the raiders called such captives frilla or thralls. For now, you know the immediate arithmetic. The body you thought consecrated is currency. You hear the scrape of metal on timber when they chain a woman who screams until the light above blinks out of fear. You try to shape a memory of something holy, an image of your hands folded at the lectern, but the memory is brittle, like parchment that has been wet and dried. The ship pitches. Water moves against the hull like patience. One of the women begins to pray softly in Latin. Another covers her face and weeps with the sound of a small animal. Above them, on the open deck, the men laugh in a language you do not yet understand. The shore disappears. The island recedes until it's no more than a stain on the weather. In the hold you hear names from the monastery. Abbess Elfleid, Brother Tilwyn, Brother Eadfrith. The names you had learned in the choir book. You also hear a different set of names, the name of a captain, a name that will appear only once in later Norse sagas and in scattered annals. They call him a hafti, a sea lord. Later chroniclers will call him a skjald, a man who rode the waves like a long blade. Contemporary Anglo-Saxon sources will not provide his name. The silence of those records is a kind of violence. You feel the vessel eat the sea. You taste iron on your tongue when you imagine the altar stone left open to char and smoke. You begin to reorder your life around immediate cues, the grind of timber, the rattle of chains, the short step of a boot approaching. You think of the treasure they took, the cross with garnets, the illuminated gospel, objects you had touched while dusting. You remember that the monks had argued quietly about whether the relics were a blessing or a temptation. None of those arguments mattered the morning the men came. On deck, under a sky that promises nothing, the raiders rough-housed with the monks' gold as if it were flotsam. Below, the women fold themselves into small private deaths. This is the first fortnight in which your world is defined by other people's calculation. It is a world built on the measurement of bodies, age, teeth, teeth line, scars. The sailors come down to check the stock. A woman is hauled up by her hair when a man above decides to test youth. He spits the name of a god you've never been taught. The abbess, who once walked the cloister with authority, had her throat cut in the sand. Her authority now is salt. There is a name in a later Irish lament. Alcuin of York writes to a friend about the desolation wrought on holy places in the north, and though Alcuin does not list names in a roll call, his anger fills the spaces where names have been stripped. You concentrate on detail, the smell of tar, the way the rope burns skin, the small private economies the women make to survive, like pressing a scrap of wool into a breast to warm a child no one will acknowledge. On the second week, the men begin to teach you a vocabulary of shame. They force you to cover your head with a rough cloth and drag you past altars and scriptures they have looted, letting the pages flutter. One of them slams a book to the deck and laughs at the way vellum shivers. You learn the cadence of a new threat, the ritual, the assessment, the division that will determine whether you're to be kept in a house, traded at market, or bound to a warrior as a concubine. Each man on deck who examines you is a judge in a law you never consented to. On the third week, the ship reaches land along a coast that will later be named in sagas and charters. The men chant something that sounds like triumph. Your hope is a tiny thing that evaporates in the sun. They haul you to a terrahus or thrall house, a word that archaeologists will later graft onto layers of earth and pottery. You're washed not out of charity, but because a thrall with lice fetches less at market. A woman with a scarred hand stands and examines you like a trader would examine a horse. Her eyes are clinical. She asks the slashed questions. Can you bear children? Can you read? Do you know herbal cures? She thumbs your teeth to see whether pregnancy can be expected. You answer nothing, because any assertion could be used to construct a sail. After this, a priest of the north, a godi, will pronounce which of you are to be used in a public ritual, and which will be distributed in households. You witness another woman's small revolt. She flattens her chest, bites the hand that lifts her veil, screams prayers to saints whose faces are already burned into memory. The revolt is ended with a strip of leather and the knowledge that resistance is loud and costly. The thrall house is a threshold. You pass through it like a thing that is catalogued and stamped. The ritual they call blot is not a private act. It happens in a clearing or at an altar stone with neighbours watching. Men, women, children. It will be written of in the family sagas as a lawful claiming. A captive woman is placed on the stone. The godi takes a bowl of blood from a slain horse. The master cuts his palm. They bind hands and declare a blood bond. You feel every part of your life evaporate into that moment. Your title as sister, the simple obedience of prayer, the slow accumulation of years in a pattern of days. What remains is the rough physics of flesh and control. Observers will later call this marriage, in sagas to justify lineage. Clerical writers will call it profanation. Both narratives seek to make the act comprehensible, but neither can give you back what it took. The women who are chosen for this ritual are not chosen for love. They are chosen for spectacle, for ritualized domination. When the master marks the captive and the crowd roars, the ritual has transformed her into property in the eyes of the law that governs these men. You are moved from the authority of the altar to the authority of a man who wears a knife at his hip. The world is now a set of households across which you will be passed or remain, tethered to a lineage you did not choose. They call some of you Frilla Christina in later sources, Christian concubine. The phrase is recovered by historians mostly from Norse texts and later glosses. The use is contested and will be debated for centuries. For you, at the time, language is a tool of survival. A word might save a day. The first household you enter smells of peat and stale beer. The master's wife eyes you and makes a calculation. Threat, labour, status. Some wives will be cruel because a new woman is a rival for status or affection. Others will understand that two women under one roof live under the same man's decisions and will reach out with small kindnesses that confound the idea of simple victimhood. You're set to work. Mend cloth, spin, cook. Your literacy may make you useful. Reading for a household, teaching the master's children, copying simple letters. The skills once meant for service to God are converted into household capital. There is a quiet, private violence in that conversion. You're forced to speak to a child in a language you do not share and teach them a prayer you cannot hear. In time, you will repeat names you learned in the choir to lull an infant. You will use those prayers like threads, tethering a small life you did not intend into your secret. Pregnancy arrives for many of you. The Vikings prize fertility. Children are wealth and strength. Your body becomes a vessel in a political economy. There is no official protection for a captive who becomes with child. The master's household exploits the child as it will the mother. Births are attended by other thralls. There is no midwife trained in the monastery's ways. The mortality of these pregnancies is high. You learn of obstetric injury when a neighbour's mother never recovers from delivery and is left with a body that no longer functions in the way she once expected. There are terms, obstetric fistula, incontinence, that will appear only in modern scholarship, but the physical reality is present and immediate. Women who survive become weary, their bodies altered by repeated conception and labour. The medieval world provides few remedies. Empirical knowledge lives among elder women and within the kitchen. For some captured women, birth becomes a double erasure. the loss of mitigation by convent life, and the forming of new ties that complicate the notion of identity. You will fear children and hunger for them in turns, because they tether you and make you visible in a way that sometimes guards against strangling cruelty and sometimes exacerbate it. The moral calculus in the Christian world is different, but it does not offer rescue. Contemporary Anglo-Saxon and Continental chroniclers record these raids with outrage. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle will mark 793 as a year of terror. Alcuin writes letters that read like elegies for a civilization under assault. These writers name places and describe devastation, but their primary focus is on the monastery's gold and the sacrilege. They do not tell the daily fates of the women taken. The institutional silence is not accidental. The Church's public response is to blame paganism, to call for penance and prayer. The practical response is often paralysis. Kings and ealdormen lack fleet or rapid response forces. Mercantile towns will later raise taxes to build defences. Monasteries will invest in fortified walls. But the immediate century has already been changed. The men who took you do not stop. They refine the system by which they extract value from monastic sites. They shall return to the coasts of Britain, Ireland, the Frankish lands. Each raid is a template. Each raid teaches the next. For you, the point of history is not an annal entry, but the slow accumulation of daily strategies. How to hide a cross, how to braid hair in secret, how to make your body less visible to hands that count. The Norse practice of taking women from monasteries is documented in multiple later sources. The Icelandic sagas, continental annals, and scattered genealogies that show English names intermixed in Scandinavian family trees. Historians will read those records and find traces, names, isotopic evidence, artifacts that corroborate a pattern. Archaeology contributes a different language. Graves with mixed iconography, skeletal remains showing repeated childbirth, isotopes in teeth that point to childhood spent on another shore. A woman's grave in the Orkneys or in the Outer Hebrides with a cross and a Thor's hammer will make a historian's chest tighten. It is proof that the boundary between conqueror and captive, between faiths, is porous and lived in the bones. For the women taken in 793 and in later years, the evidence will be diffuse. A marginal note in a chronicle, a saga line that names an English mother for a Norwegian chieftain, the stubborn survival of a Christian hymn in an otherwise pagan household. History collects these shards and, in a way that is intimate and cruel, makes them into a story. Your days settle into a rhythm of labour and small resistances. You are taught Old Norse commands, and you teach a child his first words in Latin in the nights. You carve a cross on a scrap of wood and tuck it beneath your mattress. You scratch psalms into a bowl when you have a moment alone. These acts are dangerous, but they are also the devices of survival. The master's household sometimes punishes you for secret prayer, but the punishments are instrumented more to terrorize than to destroy. A public beating, a shaving of the head, a burnt mark, these are meant to reduce you to a pliant instrument. Yet hidden faith is a stubborn ember. You learn how ritual can be inverted and how ritual can be preserved. You teach a child to make the sign of the cross and tell him a story of a saint. He will use that gesture decades later to open a market or to bless a wedding. You cannot foresee such consequences, but the minute acts you commit have weight you do not measure. Some women in other households discover small comforts too. Old women who remember monastic healings teach midwifery practices that save lives. A master's wife may secretly barter for a preserved psalter to read by in the hearthlight. The domestic world that claims you is not uniform. It contains cruelty and tenderness in uneven measure. The legal status of children born to Friele is ambiguous. In law codes that will be written later in Scandinavia, Gregos, Gulathing laws, there are provisions about concubinage, inheritance, and the status of children. These codes are later than the events we describe, but they reflect social patterns already in place. A child might be acknowledged and raised as a son of the house, or might be left with no claim. That uncertainty shapes your decisions. You may plead for recognition and lie awake listening for the master's voice. You may decide in secret to flee with a child when you see the chance. Escape is rare and dangerous, but not impossible. There are stories in the sagas, oral and then written, about women who ran to the sea in winter and crossed to the Isles, about captives who were ransomed back by distant relatives. Such stories circulate as both hope and warning. For many, the real acts of resistance are quieter. the retention of a secret prayer book, the teaching of the Lord's Prayer to a granddaughter who will later bring it into a court and change a king's mind. The Church's inability to rescue captives has consequences that historians debate. Some argue that the failure damaged ecclesiastical authority, others emphasize the Church's long-term survival and adaptation. The more intimate story is of families and kinship. Parents who sent daughters to convents expected sanctity and protection. That expectation was betrayed in a very public way. The monastery that raised your voice and taught you to sing now becomes an archetype of vulnerability. Some families will stop sending daughters, others will reconfigure the monastery as a more secular place. The collapse of assumed sanctity alters patterns of female social mobility and changes who can access literacy. Monasteries did adapt. They fortified, they stored fewer portable treasures, they changed their architectural configurations. These institutional changes are recorded in charters, in building phases archaeologists identify in the shifting language of monastery accounts. But none of those changes bring back the women who were taken. Your absence becomes part of a statistical change that clerks will record without an adequate human face. Where records do exist, they are oblique. A monk in Northumbria writes to the king, complaining that holy places are laid waste, a phrase that echoes in many manuscripts. The same manuscripts do not detail the single woman's life behind the phrase. Only fragments survive, a marginal note with a name, a line in a saga, a hasty annalist who will remark on ransom paid in a king's ledger. It is in the margins then that women's stories survive. Later, in Scandinavia, genealogies will include English names among noble lines. Sometimes those lines note that a matriarch was foreign, an English woman brought to this household. The note is terse, the memory partial, but it exists. Archaeology supplies a second voice. Female skeletons with healed fractures, isotopic signatures of a childhood in Britain, jewellery with Christian crosses. These data points are factual anchors. They do not give us the interiority of prayer and despair, but they confirm movement, the movement of bodies, of faith, of lineage. The sagas complicate the picture. Written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, they preserve oral memories of earlier centuries. They are not straightforward records. They are literary artifacts shaped by political pressure and Christian scribes. Still, they preserve a persistent motif. Foreign women introduced to Norse households become vectors of change. A woman taught to read Latin will teach runes in return. A woman's prayers will move a husband's conscience years after the raid. Sagas such as Egil's Saga and the Laxdæla Saga include episodes where an English woman influences a man's conversion. These are narrative devices in the saga's hands, but when read alongside archaeology and annals, they form part of a mosaic that argues for a real effect. Women were agents of change even in captivity. You, reading this, must balance skepticism with empathy. The sagas will harden into history and popular imagination. Your task as a listener is to hear the human core beneath the literary shape. The transformation of Norse religious practice in the centuries following the raids is complex. Christianity arrives gradually in Scandinavia, often through kings who accept baptism for political reasons, merchants who trade with Christian polities, and clergy who establish missions. But within this broad process, the role of captured women cannot be dismissed. They are often the ones who maintain Christian devotion within households, teach children prayers, and preserve objects of veneration. The conversion of local rulers in places such as Norway and Denmark in the 10th and 11th centuries will involve many causes. The personal testimony of wives, concubines, and mothers who had Christian upbringing is one of those causes. When King Olaf Tryggvason or King Harald Bluetooth accept baptism, their decisions are political. Yet those political decisions have private roots. A child who learned the Lord's Prayer at a mother's knee, a queen who kept relics in her chest, a household that preserved a psalm. These small acts aggregate into broader change. The irony is bitter. Violence intended to humiliate a faith helps spread it in ways the perpetrators did not foresee. The cost of that spread is not abstract. Bodies pay for it. Women who become midwives in new lands carry memories of convent gardens in their hands while they press wombs in crude births. They survive through knowledge that monks once taught them: herbs, compressions, incisions. This knowledge circulates in domestic settings and becomes part of a lay medical practice that benefits children and mothers in Norse settlements. The same women's labour provides literacy for their offspring, who may carry clerical knowledge into legal contexts that shape early medieval Scandinavia. That is not consolation for the pain those women endured. It is an uncomfortable fact about how culture moves through violation and patience. The woman who carved a cross into a spoon in secret might, without knowing it, teach her grandson to read a prayer aloud in a king's hall. That grandson might in turn sponsor a church. The chain of consequence is brittle and morally chaotic. You do not resolve the contradiction by romanticizing the survival. The brutality is not softened by the eventual spread of Christianity. Better to state plainly what the record shows. Captivity was violence. Its aftermath shaped history in ways both terrible and consequential. There are recorded cases that echo the Lindisfarne story. Iona, Kells, and other monasteries suffered raids in the 9th and 10th centuries. Nuns appear among captives in multiple accounts. The Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Innisfallen record coastal attacks where women were taken. In 802, Iona is attacked and certain captives are carried away. In later years, Anglo-Saxon and Frankish correspondence mention people held abroad and ransomed. The pattern is clear. Coastal religious houses are targets because they are both repositories of wealth and locations with vulnerable populations who might be enslaved. The raids did not create slavery. The Norse world already practiced forms of slavery. But the systematic targeting of monastic women in raids intensified the flow of women into Scandinavian households and created specific roles: frilla, concubine with Christian background, that shape the social fabric for generations. Your personal rituals are small and cunning. You press a scrap of illuminated vellum into a hollow of a clay pot hidden under the hearthstone. You keep the memory of bell tones in your ears and shape them into a lullaby. You teach a child the cadence of Psalm 23 in whispers. You do not renounce survival when you do this. You fold devotion into tactics. You decide when to show faith and when to conceal it. A master who is indifferent to your beliefs is a safe harbour. One who is hostile is a storm. You learn to read small signs, the direction of a glance, the position of a knife. You learn to barter identity for small gains. If you can teach the master's son to read a Lord's Prayer, you gain a defender later. If you refuse, you invite cruelty. These are not choices of principle. They are the small calculations of endurance. Over time, the quiet rounds of domestic life carve away at the edges of your monastic self, but do not erase it. You preserve certain gestures, crossing yourself inside a pantry, mouthing a psalm while kneading bread, until the gestures become the architecture of secrecy. We must say plainly what the sources allow. The detailed interior lives of these women are rarely recorded. What survives are traces, archaeological data, a few legal codices, sagas mentions, annals complaints. Reconstructing lived experience requires careful triangulation. Historians use osteology to detect repeated childbirth, isotopes to suggest childhood geography, and textual criticism to weigh the saga's testimony. From these fields, a composite emerges. Women enslaved from British monasteries carried religious and practical knowledge into Norse households. They bore children, endured violence, practiced clandestine devotion, and in some cases influenced conversion. Where texts name individuals, Hildegun, Egifu, Gunhild, those names carry with them a fog of uncertainty. They may refer to the same person across sources, or to different women sharing a Christian name. The work of historians is to hold the imprecision tightly, and still render the narrative with rigour. There are legal and theological tensions in the medieval response. The Church deemed suicide a mortal sin. So many women considering death weighed the eternal cost against the present misery. Some tried to starve themselves, others attempted escape. The Church's silence about captive women is complicated by pastoral care that did occur. Priests who ministered in exile, letters consoling communities, monasteries that later collected funds to ransom captives. Alcuin's letters are an example of clerical response. Eloquent and furious, they call for pilgrimage and penance, but they also express despair and an inability to provide immediate relief. Later, ecclesiastical writers will attempt to canonize sufferers or to remember them as martyrs, but official sainthood is rare. The institutional church had limited instruments to protect women who were taken across the sea into societies beyond its jurisdiction. That limitation is not merely administrative, It alters how communities understand divine protection and the meaning of sanctity. The moral weight of abandonment is heavy. Parents who dedicated daughters to cloisters did so with the expectation of both spiritual and physical safety. That promise was violated. Families sometimes paid ransom to recover women, other times they never could. The economic realities of ransom, its cost and the insecurity of sea voyages, meant that many remained abroad for life. Records in continental chancelleries show transactions where merchants or bishops arranged ransoms for captives, but such cases are the exception rather than the rule. The majority of captive women who survived were assimilated into their new contexts. Their names change, their language changes, but traces remain. Those traces appear in family pedigrees of later Norwegian and Danish houses, where foreign maternal lines are noted and sometimes even celebrated as part of a household's cosmopolitan legitimacy. There are archaeological cases that give a life-size sense of what captivity produces. The woman's grave in the Orkneys with both a Thor's hammer and a cross is a clean example. Isotopes tell us she grew up in Britain. Osteology suggests repeated births. Grave goods speak to a hybrid identity. Such finds are not proof of a single narrative, but they illuminate the lived aftermath of raiding. Material culture is stubborn. Objects tell of suspended loyalties. A baby's toy with a Christian motif found in a Norse settlement hints at the child's mother's heritage. A spindle whorl carved with a tiny Christ cross found embedded in a longhouse is evidence of private devotion. These objects are not big proclamations, they are the cumulative whispers that give us evidence of adaptation and survival. DNA studies in the 20th and 21st centuries complicate the picture further. Genetic traces of British and Irish ancestry appear in Scandinavian populations dating to the early medieval period. Those traces do not map neatly onto individual stories, but they indicate movement of people, women included, across the North Sea. To present DNA as decisive is to misunderstand its limits and power. It confirms migration. It cannot name trauma or faith. It cannot tell whether a woman laughed with her children or wept herself awake at night. But it can tell us that bodies moved, and that the offspring of those bodies left genetic traces that persist. Those traces are a kind of factual restitution. The presence of lineages in lands once thought to be homogeneous is proof of contact, exchange, and the lived consequences of violence. Consider a reconstructed life. A girl enters a convent at 8, learns to read, to tend the sick, to bind books. At 15 she is dragged into a ship and carried to a shore, with words she cannot pass and rituals that profane her vows. She becomes a midwife, a teacher, a concubine, a mother. She dies at 34, worn by births and sorrows, and is buried with both a cross and an amulet. Her name is not preserved in a chronicle, but her descendants carry a memory of a woman who came from the West. That narrative fragment repeats across generations. The scale and texture of such lives are the true archive. They are not always present in the triumphant prose of kings or the dry line of annalists, but they underpin the social changes historians trace. The ethical demands of representing such histories are intense. We must not aestheticize suffering. We must not romanticize women's influence as some compensatory narrative for the violence inflicted on them. Instead, we present a sober causality. Raiding produced movement. Movement produced hybrid communities. Hybrid communities contained both acts of cruelty and acts of resilience. The women who survived did so in ways that were pragmatic, religious, strategic. They kept fragments of prayer and used those fragments to shape new lives. They were not saints in the sanitized sense, they were human beings making choices under pressure. Their survival strategies included collaboration at times, concealment at others, and occasional rebellions. To honour them is to tell the story without softening the violence. The long memory of the raids is uneven. In Anglo-Saxon England, the raid of 793 is stamped as the beginning of a new age in some historiography, the so-called Viking Age. This label is modern and constructed, but the attack on Lindisfarne is often cited as its opening salvo. The date appears in chronicles because chroniclers found the assault on a holy place iconically significant. Later generations will fold the event into a larger narrative of raiding, settlement, and integration. Yet the individual human experiences, especially of the women taken, are only sometimes visible in that grand narrative. When they are, it's often through oblique references or hagiographic tales that transform suffering into martyrdom. The truth is grimmer. Many women lived long lives of enforced labour and secret prayer that did not end in sanctity but in fatigue and the slow fading of religious certainty. The institutional consequences of the raids reshaped monastic architecture. Some monasteries fortified and stored movable wealth in different forms. Charters revealed grants for building defences, for hiring watchers, for paying fleets for protection. The material culture of monasticism changes. Fewer portable reliquaries, more immovable stone constructions. Yet fortification does not stop every raid. The economy of coastal communities evolves. Some become trading nodes with Norse partners, others decline as trade routes shift under the pressure of violence. The story of the nuns is part of this larger economic and spatial restructuring. Their absences are part of a demographic shift that affects labour, piety, and the distribution of literacy. This is not a tidy cause and effect. It is an entangled set of adaptations with women at its heart. The voices that survive are often mediated. A poem in Old English may lament the desolation of holy places. A later saga may claim a woman persuaded a chieftain to accept baptism. A genealogy may note an English mother in a Norwegian family. Each source has biases. Clerical writers emphasize sacrilege and wealth transfer. Saga writers dramatize lineage and honor. Legal codes configure household relations. The historian must pass these agendas, extracting the consensual facts without imposing narrative closure where none exists. When the evidence is sparse, we should not create details to fill the emptiness. We must instead hold ambiguity in our retelling. That is a hard practice because audiences want names and clean ends. The past refuses to oblige. In the 10th and 11th centuries, as Christianity becomes more established in Scandinavia, some of the descendants of captured women play visible roles. Women with English ancestry become queens and patronesses. Their origin stories are sometimes invoked to legitimize dynastic claims. The instrumentalization of such heritage is political. A foreign maternal line may be presented as a sign of cosmopolitan alliance. In that political use, the memory of a captive woman is transformed into a resource, a way of narrating power. This transformation is itself a kind of erasure. The woman's trauma becomes a pedigree in a king's biography. It is another layer in which her lived suffering is subsumed by political exigency. We must consider the psychological consequences for women who lived their whole lives in enforced service. The term learned helplessness is modern, but the dynamics are ancient. Repeated trauma, degradation, and unpredictability produce a state in which resistance seems futile. This is not a moral judgment on survivors. It is a clinical observation about human response to prolonged abuse. Some women retained fierce inward lives of prayer that constituted resistance. Others adapted outwardly and found ways to create meaning in domestic power, teaching, or artisan skill. The variability is what we must emphasize. To reduce the narrative to pure victimhood is to rob survivors of their agency. To minimize the trauma is to sanitize it. We must hold both realities, the violence and the resourcefulness. Some captives are ransomed. There are records of families paying for women's return, of merchants arranging exchanges, of ecclesiastical fundraising for ransom. When a woman returns, her reception is complex. She may be welcomed as a rescued soul, or met with suspicion. Has she been compromised? Has she borne children abroad? The religious framework for readmission varies. Sometimes nuns who are ransomed are received back into monastic life after penance and ritual purification. Other times they are barred, their vows considered void by circumstances. The Church's ambiguous posture toward rescued women reflects its own struggle to process an unprecedented social reality. The moral theology of captivity, rape, and forced concubinage was not fully developed in the early medieval period. Later canonical rulings would try to grapple with the issue, but the lived reality in the 9th century is messy and often cruel. The stories that reach us are often partial. A marginal note in a 9th century gospel mentions that a nun named Ethelthryth kept a chain of prayer in exile. A later saga records that a chieftain's wife taught her husband's children a foreign hymn. These are small lines, but when they cross-reference with archaeological evidence, we can be more confident. The reconstruction is painstaking. It is the work of cross-disciplinary triangulation. It is also an ethical call to render the scope of suffering without transforming it into spectacle. Your responsibility as listener is to let the discomfort stand. These were not stories told for entertainment in their own age. They were human tragedies stitched into family memory. The modern reception of these histories is itself a story of selective memory. Romantic images of Vikings as noble raiders were constructed in the 19th century and popularized through national myth-making. That myth-making often erased the gendered violence that accompanied raiding. Scholarship in the 20th and 21st centuries has tried to correct this imbalance, emphasizing the role of women and the brutality of slavery. Yet popular culture continues to oscillate. Some works celebrate Viking heroism, while others highlight suffering and exploitation. Accurate historical representation requires resisting simplification. The past is messy, so must our telling be. There are specific archives that scholars rely upon. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle entries are cornerstone texts for the early raids. Alcuin's letters provide contemporary clerical response. The annals of Ulster and Irish chronicles detail coastal attacks and the carrying off of people. The Icelandic sagas, written later, supply narrative forms that often reflect older memory. Legal codes in Scandinavia, compiled later in the medieval period, show the institutional handling of concubinage and inheritance. Archaeological reports provide the bodily dimension: graves, isotopes, tool marks on bones. The convergence of these sources gives an evidentiary basis for the narratives we reconstruct. Good scholarship disciplines imagination with method. That discipline matters when we discuss women whose lives were rendered invisible by centuries of silence. The historiographical debate is alive. Some scholars emphasize economic motives for raids: wealth, trade disruption, and resource acquisition. Others underscore political opportunities: exile, land acquisition, and the formation of mercenary networks. Feminist historians stress gendered violence and the specific targeting of women from monastic houses. Each perspective sheds light on different aspects of the phenomenon. A robust account includes all these elements without flattening them into a single causal story. The capture of nuns is an intersection. Economic incentive, religious desecration, and the gendering of slavery work together to produce a specific historical outcome. Consider the long-term legacy. In the centuries after the initial raids, Scandinavian societies convert politically and religiously. Churches are built, bishops are appointed, laws are rewritten. The origins of some Christian communities in Scandinavia are mediated by women whose childhood devotion carried into new households. When conversion is formalized by kings, it is often an elite and political process. Yet beneath that veneer lies the slow accretion of private devotion in family homes, a devotion kept alive by women who had been raised Christian elsewhere. That slow work of domestic religion is underdocumented but crucial. It connects the violence of the raids to the eventual transformation of Norse belief, not as a tidy teleology, but as a tangled aftermath in which victims sometimes become inadvertent vectors of change. The memory of these women is partial in the archive but full in consequence. Genealogies, local traditions, and artifacts carry their traces. Modern archaeology and DNA studies corroborate a pattern of movement. Scholarly work continues to unearth details: marginal notes deciphered, graves re-examined, isotopic data refined. Each new finding adds edges to a picture that is both horrific and instructive. The point is not to triumph over the Norse or to indict blindly. The point is to recognize a human history in which violence and adaptation produce new social orders. These orders have real costs borne by specific bodies, mostly women, whose suffering enabled shifts in power and belief. The final reckoning is not rhetorical. It is forensic and moral. We can enumerate sources: the Anglo-Saxon chronicle entry for 793, Alcuin's letters from the continent, the annals of Ulster noting coastal raids, the sagas preserving oral memory, legal codes recording concubinage, archaeological graves with mixed iconography, and isotopic and genetic studies that point to cross-sea movement. From these data we assemble a story that is true to the evidence. Raids targeted coastal monasteries. Women were taken, some were ransomed, many assimilated, some preserved Christian practice and transmitted it to descendants. The violence had demographic and cultural consequences across centuries. The specificity of names and acts is limited by the sources, and the gaps are real. We must honour their limits without retreating into doubt. In the end, the quiet devastation is the most honest image. The nuns taken from Lindisfarne and other holy houses were rarely recorded as individuals in chronicles that preferred the drama of burned altars and stolen reliquaries. yet their absence is present in the altered architectures of households, in the hybrid graves, in the names passed down in foreign courts. Their suffering contributed, paradoxically, to the religious transformations that would consume the Old Norse cults. That transformation robbed them of the moral simplicity many histories desire. There are no tidy endings. Conversion can be a byproduct of violence.